Hi everyone, welcome. I'm down here in my wormery. All these bins here are for the purposes of composting with worms. And everything over here to the right is my newest stuff. As you work your way over towards the shelf, you start to approach all of the older stuff. And when things get to the point where they're almost ready for the castings to be harvested, my preferred choice for trying to make that happen is to follow the idea of letting the worms do all the work. So I set up a feeding area on just one edge of the bin in the hopes that the worms will simply evacuate their finished castings on their own. So when those worms are ready to get hauled out, and I think they'll be ready to get hauled out soon, I've got some nice new bins here waiting for them. And even prior to getting to that phase, somewhere between that phase, the migration and the harvesting, and what you see all the way over here and all the other systems where there's just everyday composting happening is what's going on in the two systems we're going to check in on today. It's these two bins that have African nightcrawlers in them. That's what the abbreviation you see on there, ANC, stands for. These systems are doing what I refer to as foraging, and they've been doing that for the past 20 days. So these 20-day foraging systems have just been sitting here untouched. They got their last feeding 20 days ago. Nothing but just, worms working on whatever they were fed and polishing off what remains in there. And after 20 days, I'm just curious to see what's going on, mainly because of what we see in this one over here. All that moisture collecting on the top covering newspapers. So I'm going to get a glove on. We're going to get these systems up on the bench, see how foraging's progressing. So let's get to work. So now, I did switch the order, because I like it for, from the point of view of the camera, from your point of view, that we've got bin numbers 1 and then bin number 2 going from left to right from your perspective. And the only reason it was reversed on the shelf is because on the top shelf I go left to right, but then I switch back. So the shelf on which these systems were resting is the one place where the order is sort of reversed. So just my little kind of quirky setup and my preference just to show things on the video a certain way. So now, besides having these top covering newspapers, which appear to have been nibbled away to some degree by the worms in numerous locations, as I can see here, there was also this top covering sort of feeding zone indicator, basically is what I refer to that as. It's really nothing more than a coffee filter positioned over where we last fed. I did watch the video from last time, but the only thing that sticks out in my mind in terms of what we last fed these guys is, can you see this little spider here? Probably not too happy about us coming over here. Little protector of the bin. So, this one seems to be holding up a lot better. Feeding zone indicator just meant to show where we last fed the watermelon that we fed is the only thing that's sticking out in my mind as far as like whole foods that they were fed. There would have also been, I guess, we did put in coffee and worm chow and maybe other things too, but offhand that's the only stuff that comes to mind. So I'm just really curious to see what my first impressions are. I don't like this. I don't like it when I see stuff that just clumps together. Kind of tells me that we might be dealing with a little bit too much moisture in here. You might have noticed the paper kind of moving around a little bit. That's because I've got a fan mounted up, hanging off some of the pipes up on the ceiling. Moving air across the room. This feels to me like a piece of plastic. I guess anytime I bump into something that doesn't seem like it belongs in the bin, it just gets pulled out. And so yeah, I was actually thinking that maybe when we're finished here, if it does feel to me like things are a little bit too damp, I'll just leave those paper covers off, and since the fan is already blowing right here onto this position where I've been drying bins with the fan, maybe we can just simply till up the material and leave it out here in front of the moving air so that it can possibly dry off a little bit. So now, besides the watermelon, coffee, and worm chow placed in here 20 days ago, we did also collect a whole bunch of like top covering newspaper and other bits of paper type materials that were already in the bin, and then those items got dropped down right beneath the feeding, getting soaked with all kinds of melon juices and other things, probably making that stuff also into a fairly tempting thing for the worms to dig into. And it does seem like after 20 days we're pretty much finding virtually no leftovers. And I'm also kind of pleased to see that the material is kind of crumbly and does not seem to be overly wet. Hopefully I'm not just, I don't know. It usually does seem like in the area where we last fed watermelon is the place where you would expect to see the most damp material in your bin. So my hope is as we work our way to the outskirts of the bin, we'll find stuff that's even drier and more flaky and crumbly. And there is a good number of worms living in this bin. I definitely remember from the last time we checked in, every time I would till up a handful of material, it would always be loaded with tons and tons of worms. And it does seem to me like we're not kind of in that nasty, muddy situation that really prompted me to mount up the fan to the ceiling in the first place. Although I don't see the harm in possibly leaving these systems out here under the fan to get a little bit of airflow, to possibly lose a little bit of their moisture to evaporation, only because in certain places it does seem like the material does seem to still be tending to clump a bit. Yeah, you know, I think that is probably the way we're going to end up leaving things here today when we're done exploring and inspecting things. So feeding area over in bin number 2 looked pretty good, and I don't know, when I set them up as bin numbers 1 and 2, I still seem to go left to right from my perspective. So we started at bin number 2, now we're in bin number 1. And here too, it seems fair to assume that we're going to find a very similar result of virtually no leftovers. Perhaps a scrap of paper or something that would have been part of the bedding placed in and beneath the feeding, but finding anything else in here seems unlikely. I mean, here and there I did bump into other objects, kind of slow composting materials like little chunks of wood and stems and other things. Not too worried about that. Usually I'll pick stuff like that, especially, you know, in a bin like this, ones that are getting so close to harvest already. So I'm not sure if I mentioned the system's ages yet. These systems are now 335 days old, so we're only 30 days away from these 2 bins reaching a year old in age. So here's a pretty good size object. This is the stem of a pumpkin. Stems of pumpkin are just things that I had laying around. I had so many pumpkins, and every time I would chop one up and turn it into worm food, I would have a pumpkin stem laying around. So pumpkin stems started making their way into multiple bins of mine, and this appears to be one of them. I thought I bumped into some larger objects over in the other bin. Those might have actually also been pumpkin stem, but ones that had already started fragmenting into little pieces. Here too, just a stick. Usually you'll find me picking that sort of stuff out. Here I'm sort of not paying that much attention, but one thing I'm very diligent about is these little blue. Every time I bump into a little bit of blue, every time I find something blue in my worm bins, I always pull that out, because that is just some sort of material that made its way into my shredder once and subsequently into a bunch of my bedding material. So for months now I've been pulling out that blue stuff that never goes anywhere. And I'm kind of hoping that we get to the finish line with that stuff one of these days soon. This is the stem of a banana, also making really nice progress. So I think, you know, since we're not feeding, we're simply going to allow the process of foraging to continue here. I really was mostly interested in exploring why that top covering of paper in bin number 2 was so seemingly soaked, or at least stained as if it had been soaked. It made me worry that we might encounter a bit too much moisture in these bins, but I do feel like we're in pretty good shape, and we're probably gearing up for a pretty successful migration. However, I think I'm going to play it a little bit differently this time, even though we're only 30 days away from the systems hitting a year old. And as nice as it would be to possibly be done migrating worms out of their finished castings before it hits a year old, I got a funny feeling we're going to exceed 1 year old before we finally do the first haul out of worms from the system, because we're not going to start the migration of the worms today. We're going to simply do a quick aeration of the entire contents of both systems. So we've already pretty neatly unearthed the feeding zone, where we found pretty much nothing. Now I just want to make sure that we've tilled up and upturned all the material and aerated all the material in the system, and then we're going to simply leave it pretty much the way it is here, uncovered, under the fan. I'll just turn the lights off behind me as I leave the wormery, but the fan will continue blowing. And as a result, the material in this bin will definitely start losing moisture. I've had numerous systems where I've successfully managed to drop the moisture content in those systems considerably using the method, you know, that we're going to use here, just blowing the fan onto the bins. So I think we've tilled up the edge closest to me pretty nicely in bin number 1. Let's make sure we do the same over here in bin number 2, and then we'll still be left with that last edge closest to you, closest to the camera. Get all that tilled up and aerated. And yeah, there's a good amount of moisture in this stuff, but thank heavens it's not clumping like mud. Thank heavens it's really crumbly. And it is kind of fun to see just how many worms are actually in this stuff. Pretty populated bins, that's for sure. These night crawlers, they've been busy mating and increasing their numbers. So I think this edge too is now in pretty good shape. Just being aerated, upturned a little bit. Anytime I do find a larger clump of stuff that seems to want to hold together, I just kind of break it apart. And luckily it all does seem to break apart pretty readily in my hands. So one more edge really quick, just the edge closest to you guys, so you'll get a nice close-up view of what's going on over here. And then we'll just leave these systems out here overnight, and then I'll probably come back in here, and before I need to clear off the bench to do some other worm bin check-ins tomorrow, maybe I'll even come in here one more time and till in the drier stuff on the surface and bring up some other material to the surface to let that stuff dry a little bit too. And even if I'm going to be working out here on the bench on some other systems, I'll probably return these to these 2 spots here so that they can continue to get blown on and dried by the fan. And then I think at some point, once the material in these systems is noticeably drier, I think that's when we're going to initiate the migration of the worms out of this stuff. I just feel like that's going to be possibly the better time to do it, you know, because in the past I feel like I've tried to initiate the migration of the worms out of their castings when the stuff was just still too wet, and because it was too wet, the worms just didn't want to leave this stuff, you know. And then by, you know, having an edge of the bin dedicated to, you know, a migration zone, I've now kind of reduced the available space for the material to be in. So I do feel like I need this entire top surface to get the maximum drying from the fan before we start setting up the migration area. So that's kind of my thinking on these 2 bins, to see if that might result in a somewhat speedier migration of the worms out of their material. But I really don't know exactly what to expect. It's always kind of a little bit of a mystery in terms of what the worms are going to do or not do. Not everything goes as planned. But hopefully we can accomplish somewhat faster migration of the worms out of their material with these worms here, because the last few systems it's just been taking way longer than they need to, and it's, I think, mainly because of excess moisture in the systems. So I'm going to try to tackle the moisture problem first and then proceed to migrating the worms out of their material. So that's it. I'm leaving these systems right here where they are on the bench, letting the air from the fan blow right across the surface. There's a good amount of airflow hitting these things, and I'll check in on them again tomorrow morning, see how they're doing, or tomorrow afternoon, and hopefully they'll be a little bit drier. I'll give them another stir, and then probably bring them back out in front of the fan one more time to continue this way until such a time that you know, the stuff starts to feel a little bit drier. Once the stuff is dry, we'll set it up for migration and try to initiate the exit of the worms out of their material. All right, everyone, that's it for our check-in. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before I go. That's always really appreciated. If you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. That's very much appreciated as well. All right, everyone, thanks for watching. Have a great day. Bye now.